about the importance of understanding productivity. Then I want to speak about appreciating the power of productivity. If I succeed in those two things, then I believe that I can take you in terms of identifying some specific roles for HR in enhancing productivity. I also want to make a part of my presentation just to give you a feel for how we are doing in productivity in Jamaica, and using what I call the Solow model. Michael Porter is probably one of the foremost proponent of productivity. And he argues that the ability of a country to enjoy high standards of living is really a function of being able to have its firms, have productive firms. And not only do we want productive firms, but we want firms that are continuously improving their productivity. I'm going to skip this philosophical definition because you can read that, but as an economist, I'm going to focus on the economic definition of productivity. Productivity is essentially the efficiency and effectiveness with which we use resources to produce goods and services that people want. I think that last part is very important. If we produce goods and services that people don't want, then we're not operating effectively. Another way to look at productivity is through the lens of value added. Value added is nothing more than the total amount of goods that you sell minus the inputs that you bring in to produce those goods. And what it allows you to do, the value added concept allows you to look at productivity in the way the results of the value added is distributed. Okay, so as you can see, the value added is distributed in terms of taxes, interest, depreciation, labor costs, after-tax profit. And after-tax profit is then distributed in terms of dividends and return earnings for the company. So it's really something that you can get from the profit and loss statement of the company. So it's not something that we need to go and search for to actually measure, at that level at least. 3 forms of productivity we normally see in the literature people mention. One is the partial factor productivity, which is really, how productive is a particular input factor in the process. So we have labor productivity, capital productivity, and total factor productivity, right? I'm going to be talking about these some more. What this diagram is basically saying is that we are not engaging in productivity for fun, right? This is not a fun game. We are engaging in productivity because it is important for our standard of living. And in this case, we measure standard of living as GDP per capita. Okay, so one of the things that is important in looking at this picture is that if we want higher GDP per capita, we need to have GDP growing faster than the population. Okay? Now, to have higher GDP, we can actually increase the factors of production, labor and capital, right? Or we can increase the productivity of the factors of production, right? Which in fact increase overall productivity and drive GDP. Also, as part of that productivity aspect, we can focus on total factor productivity. So we focus it on the quality of the workforce, and we're focusing on the quality of the inputs that is used in the workforce. So we're talking about here the quality of capital, the quality of systems and processes and so on. One of the key point I want to make from this slide is that productivity is probably one of the single most important variable that influences a wide cross-section of macroeconomic situations. So if we have increasing productivity, workers are going to benefit, right? Because a company that is productive, it means that the company is also a low-cost producer. If you're a low-cost producer, it means that your goods and services is going to be more competitive. If you are more competitive, it means that you're going to get a larger market share. If you have a larger market share, you have to reinvest and employ more people and so on and so forth. So there's something in it for workers. The firms also have much to gain from productivity. Then we have the citizens, because government is going to get more taxes. Government getting more taxes have more to spend on the infrastructure, and the citizens benefit from the improvement in the infrastructure. So really and truly is really a driving force for macroeconomic development. I want to take that argument a little further. So I looked at the real GDP per capita, real GDP and labor productivity. And when I plot the graph there, you can see that there is a highly positive correlation. In fact, a 92.92 correlation coefficient. And what you'll find is that I don't know, and it's probably something we need to look at, but prior to the 80s, the correlation was even tighter. But since the 80s, it has been less tight. We also look at real GDP per capita, which is the standard of living, and we plot that with the labor productivity. Again, we end up with a highly positively correlated situation and a correlation coefficient of 0.91. So you can see the closeness. So you really cannot expect to have rising standard of living without improved productivity. And indeed, most of the countries in the world that experience high standards of living are the productivity leaders. This graph here, what we did is to look at US in terms of labor productivity and living standards, GDP per capita. So we have US as 100, and all the other countries is as a percentage of the US. What is interesting here in the case of Jamaica down the bottom here is that we are the lowest relative to the US. So we're talking about somewhere in the region of say, labor productivity, say roughly 4 persons per 1 person in the US, and living standards just about 1/5, somewhere there. So I'm moving on. That's the kind of introduction to my presentation. I'm moving on now to the Solow Growth Accounting Framework. And what the Solow Growth Accounting Framework is saying is that GDP growth is equal to labor force growth times the share of labor in GDP plus capital share times the growth of the capital stock plus total factor productivity. So it's saying that we can decompose GDP growth into those 3 things. A part of the Solow model now, which has been further augmented to say we can break down employed labor force into labor quality and labor quantity. We can decompose capital into ICT capital and non-ICT capital. And we can decompose total factor productivity into technology, innovation, labor management, relations, and so on and so forth, and policy. And I move straight into, I want to focus my discussion on labor in terms of quantity and quality, capital stock in terms of ICT and non-ICT, and total factor productivity, how HR can influence these relationships. I believe that HR, and this is really the starting point, HR can be very instrumental in hiring, training, retraining, and separating persons. So HR can serve the organization well by making sure that the persons who are employed are the persons who are fit for the job at hand. I find that sometimes we make the mistakes because there are persons who we need to separate from, and we delay it, and it can dramatically affect the organization negatively. It's something that we need to pay close attention to. I think HR has a powerful story to help tell in organization, in that it needs to communicate that productivity is fundamental for business sustainability, job security, and rising wages. I think we can't have any of those without we have productivity. I think HR needs to help the organization learn to measure and measure to learn. What do I mean by that? I think many organizations actually measure, but we don't learn anything from the measurement that we take. So we need to measure and learn from the measurements that we take. The measures can actually tell us where to go and how to get there. I believe HR needs to share with the rest of the managers and the employees that values, corporate values that are measured and used as rewards can be very important in aligning the behavior of employees, and build their commitment to the organization. I think that is very important. I believe that in terms of individuals and teams, HR needs to make it explicitly clear what are the expectations from these individuals and the teams, and how they help the overall objective, or how they contribute to the overall objective of the organization. I believe that people tend to work in silos, and sometimes you only see what is important as what your unit or your department do, but not necessarily thinking how you contribute to the big picture, and I think that is important. HR needs to set reachable, and I call that section stretched. What do I mean by stretched? I think that you should not make targets very easy or too easy. Otherwise, it builds complacency, right? I think, for example, in the kind of work that we do at our center, we need to continuously set very ambitious goals so that people reach for them. You know, I've seen organizations where people tell you that they have achieved 150% of their target, right? It means that the targets were low. I think HRD needs to help managers develop processes that ensure resources are allocated disproportionately to priority activities. I mean, you go into places and you see people working, and when you look, the emphasis is not on the high priority activities. So a lot of resources are spent on the low priority activities, and when the time comes, people start to, oh my, we didn't start to do that yet. I think it's very important that we focus resources disproportionately on the priority goals. We need to develop effective rewards, and these rewards must be not only monetary, but create non-monetary excitement. That's important. In terms of ICT and non-ICT, I think in many instances we say we have the hardware and we have the software, but we probably using 10-15% of the capacity of the hardware and the software, and we have these computers on our desk, but we're not networking and maximizing the utility of the things. I've seen, well, I certainly have software that I don't use 5% of it, And what we find is, for example, in Jamaica, some calculations which we did, we find that ICT contribute roughly 6% to GDP, whereas in Singapore, it's nearly 15%. So we have much more to get out of our ICT investment. With respect to non-ICT, in Jamaica, again, we 33% of GDP growth is due to non-ICT capital, compared to 30% in Singapore. So we seem to be doing almost on par with Singapore. The third point I want to make, or the third important section I want to look at, is that we need to maximize the contribution of total factor productivity. How can we do this? We can build the capacity of our firms to innovate. And I think we link back that to the first point where we're saying, make sure that when you're recruiting, the mix of persons who you recruit, you need to have people who are innovative in their thinking and in their technical capability. I've seen firms that refuse to fill vacancy because they can't, for years, because they can't find the right fit. And I think that may be a sensible thing, you know, although we know that sometimes we may have to recruit people and train them, but when we're doing that, we should see that there is the distinct potential that is, you know, the individual is good for that. I spoke about the labor management cooperation. I think that's a big issue in organizations, and the panel that was here was talking about the trust issue. And I think for some reason there is some level of trust, and I think probably it's a orientation issue also, because when we bring people into the organization, we don't sit with them and say, well then look, the organization is losing money, or the organization need to be strengthened in this way or that way. And I think workers don't totally buy into the idea that this firm are in a partnership with this firm. They tend to think that they are entitlement, but they don't see the partnership and the fact that if the firm is doing well, they'll do well. So I think that kind of labor management cooperation is important, and HR can drive that. I think we all know about best practices, but we don't go in search of these best practices, bring them into the organization and use them to drive productivity. And I think that's a good role for HR. With respect to my final thought, I think HR is in a very good position, because in most organizations, there is no one honing productivity improvement, right? There's no one taking responsibility for productivity improvement. And I think this is because of that, HR has no competition per se, right? But don't be misled. As soon as you start to reap success, you'll have competition. Thank you very much.